What is the rule of thumb on how much you should be saving for retirement? Why is that rule of thumb often wrong? And why am I giving up on airline miles credit cards? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 82nd episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody, this podcast is sponsored by Betterment, the most preferred automated investing service. Betterment has cutting-edge technology to optimize returns, minimize taxes, and save you time and money. Join over 34,000 customers who have already streamlined their portfolio management at betterment.com/roller. That's betterment.com/ROLLER. And so today's podcast is we have a mascot for it. So you may recall, if you've listened to my interview with Kate and Trevor, that in the background, their pet Mayhem, a cat, was making some racket, and we had fun with it. And I ended up putting a picture of Mayhem on the show notes for that podcast, and I mentioned it. And I invited folks to send in pictures of their pets if they wanted their pet to be, a mascot for an episode of this show. And, well, you crazy cats and kittens took me up on that offer. So today's mascot for episode 82 is Harley. Harley's picture was sent in by Ace. You've heard me mention Ace from time to time. And I'm terrible at identifying the breed of a dog. So I'm looking at this picture. I'm guessing a poodle. I'm sure Ace will quickly correct me, as will all of you once you see Harley's picture. But if you go to the show notes of this episode, you'll find those at DoughRoller.net/podcast 82, podcast 82. And scroll to the bottom. You'll see Harley's picture. Adorable. So if you've got a pet and you want them to be a mascot for an episode of this podcast, I guess a crazy little thing, but why not? Feel free to send in a picture, and we'll see if this thing takes off or not. Hey, another thing I mentioned in past episodes is that I've started to interview you guys, listeners, who have a story to tell, have a success story, or have questions. I've mentioned this. Of course, Kate and Trevor kicked that off, but I've actually got two interviews scheduled, one next week and one the following week, with listeners who've reached out to me, and we've talked via email, and so we're going to I'm going to interview them, share their stories with you, so that we can all hopefully learn and improve on our finances. So if you have a story to tell, or maybe you just have some questions and you'd like to come on the show, you're willing to share your questions with everybody else so that we can all learn. As I've mentioned, sometimes an interview is 30 minutes long, 45 minutes long, but you may have a question and it only takes us 5 minutes to discuss it. That's fine. I mean, who knows? Maybe I'll have an episode where I play 2 or 3 or 4 questions from folks where we get on the phone, and it's a real simple process. If you email me, I'll explain the process in more detail, but it's very easy to sign up for a time and a day. That's done online. You can pick whatever's convenient for you. It automatically shows you my availability. It's a pretty neat tool, actually. And I use Skype, but I can call a cell phone, a landline. If you have Skype, we could do a Skype to Skype. It doesn't matter. And we'll get on the phone and talk for a few minutes before we record the interview, just to make sure we know we're on the same page. We know where we're headed. And then I record the interview. It's that simple. It's painless. So if it's something you're interested in doing, shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net. Okay, got a number of things I want to cover today before I get to the main topic of how much you should be saving for retirement. The first is, and I mentioned this in one of the questions at the top of the show, I've kind of given up on airline miles credit cards. Here's what happened. So my wife and I are doing a lot of traveling this year, probably more personal travel, flying than we've done in any single year. And so I've been very focused on getting as much of that travel for free or as inexpensively as possible. And I had signed up for the United Mileage Plus credit card. That's worked out fine. Although United ticked me off in Chicago. That's a whole other story. We've all had nightmare experiences on airlines. And I was going to do the same thing with Delta. but I haven't yet. I haven't signed up for the Delta credit card, and as I think about it, I'm probably not going to. And here's the deal. We're going to be flying to Louisiana, and I have enough miles on Delta already for a free ticket. They start at 25,000 miles. I have about 35,000 miles. So I first went to Kayak just to see what the flights were, and I found a perfect flight for us on Delta. And so then I went to the Delta website to find that same flight so that I could use my miles for one of the tickets. Well, I couldn't find the flight. I couldn't find the price that I saw on Kayak, so I called up Delta. And the first thing they explained to me is, yes, you will not find the same price on Delta. I said, so wait a minute. I can go to Kayak and get Delta tickets cheaper than if I go to delta.com. Yes, that's right, because they're a discount website, which is just another way of saying, because that's how Delta has decided to do things. Okay, well, that's fine. Well, how much is the ticket going to cost me? And if I buy it on Delta now rather than Kayak, so that I can use my miles to get one of the tickets for free. Well, that didn't work out either, because although free round trip tickets in the continental U.S. start at 25,000 miles, as you may know, they only reserve a couple of seats on each flight at that level. And once they're gone, you have to pay more. And for me, the best I could do was to spend 40,000 miles for a free ticket. Well, I didn't have 40,000 miles to begin with, so that's out. And secondly, that would have been a horrible, horrible deal. And so, of course, what I do, I went back to Kayak where I got the cheaper price, and I bought 2 tickets and paid cash. What are you going to do? But as I thought about it, it just kind of convinced me to go back to the way I was handling my credit cards and travel rewards, and that is to use cards like either Capital One's Venture Card or Barclay Card has a card that actually I think is a little better that I'll mention here in a minute. But how do I do this? So with the Venture Card, you get 2 miles for every dollar you spend, and if you use those miles on travel, the miles are worth a penny each, standard value for a point or a mile. So effectively, it's a 2% rewards card if you use the rewards for travel. And what I like about the Venture Card is that there's no trying to figure out how many miles I have and whether that'll buy a ticket and whether the reward tickets are available for that flight, which are becoming harder and harder and harder to get. I don't have to worry about that. I just book my travel, use the card, and then when the charges hit the card, I can go in and use my miles to erase the purchase. It's that simple. And so if you think about it in the case of this flight to Louisiana, 40,000 miles, to earn those with a credit card, with, say, the Delta credit card, I'm going to have to spend $40,000, right? I'm going to get a mile per dollar spent. That would give me 40,000 miles for a free ticket. If I use that same, if I make those purchases on a Venture Card instead, $40,000 spent, which of course is a lot of money, but putting that aside, I'm going to get 80,000 miles worth $800 of travel. So in this case, the tickets were $500 each. I could have bought one of them with the Venture Card and still had $300 left over in credit for other travel, for the hotel that we're going to stay in, for example. I could have used it for that. I could have used it for car rental. So it's just the whole mileage, airline mileage credit card it's just too complicated, too time consuming. It's too unpredictable. And, for those that use it and it works for you, particularly those that fly a lot and always fly on the same airline, it may work. But for me, it's just not worth the hassle. And so I'm going back to my sort of very easy 2 miles for every dollar spent card that I can then use. I book my travel with that card, and I can just erase the purchases, if you will, with the points. Now, I've been using the Venture Card. I'm happy with it, although I'm going to switch to the Barclay Arrival Plus World Elite MasterCard. And if you want to check out a review of that, you can just go to DoughRoller.net/arrival, ARRIVAL. That'll redirect you to my review of this card. The reason I like it is because it's a 2% reward card as well, just like the Venture, but it comes with up to $400 worth of bonus miles when you first get the card, and then they also have a sort of a bonus miles program when you use the card for travel that actually can make the card worth about 2.2%. it works that way because you get 10% miles back every time you redeem your miles for travel statement credits, which is what we do. So anyway, I thought I'd just share that with you. I'd be interested in hearing how you guys handle travel, and particularly with credit cards. If you're into the miles and the travel hacking crowd, and you have some tips on that, I'd love to hear it and would share it with everyone else. So feel free to send me an email, dr@doughroller.net. But for me, cards like the Barclay card Arrival and the Capital One Venture, they just make it easy. They're very, very good rewards, and you never have to worry about whether you're going to be able to get the ticket or not, whether it's going to be available, whether they're going to charge you 25,000 miles or 40,000 miles, which is a big difference. So that experience with Delta has caused me to go back to sort of my old approach. And also the other advantage is you have fewer credit cards too. You just need one for that, rather than trying to get a card for each airline that you fly, which is a real pain. Okay, so with that, I want to turn to a few emails that I've received from folks, two of them actually. The first is from Elizabeth, and the second one is from Blake. They asked different questions, which I'll cover. I think they'll be helpful to you. I thought they were really good questions. So here's Elizabeth's email. She says, I've been listening to the podcast when I'm the only one at work, and they have been great at keeping me motivated. I have a question that is a little specific, but could lead to a broader discussion if you wanted to expand on it. I'm planning on leaving my job in the fall of 2015 to enter pharmacy school. There are a lot of small but costly to me hurdles between then and now, including some community college classes and the respective books. I started using YNAB about a month ago. About a month before my first classes started, and it's nudged me towards getting more parts of my finances in order. I recently remembered that my current employer has a 401k program that I'm not enrolled in, but they don't match contributions at all. I have an IRA that I'm contributing to already that I started with a gift from my grandfather. I'm not sure if I should bother setting up the 401k and going through the trouble of rolling it over later when I likely leave for pharmacy school. Is there some great advantage to a 401k that I'm missing but not enrolling and instead funding the IRA I already have? So, is there an advantage to putting your money in an IRA or a 401k? Well, the two primary advantages of a 401k are, one, if your employer matches. In this case, Elizabeth's employer does not, but obviously if your employer matches, that is a huge, huge advantage to a 401k. That's the first advantage. The second one is that the contribution limits for a 401k are higher. If you're under 50, the limit for a 401k in 2014 is $17,500. That can go up from year to year, but currently $17,500. And if you're under 50, the IRA contribution limit is $5,500. Obviously, much lower. Drives me crazy, by the way, that they have different contribution limits, particularly for those that don't have access to a 401k. Why shouldn't someone who's got a job but no access to a 401k be able to put away as much as someone who does have access to a 401k? I think it's absurd. But anyway, it is the way it is. Those are the two big advantages to a 401k. Now, in emails back and forth with Elizabeth, I learned that she would not be contributing more than $5,500. So the two big potential advantages to a 401k do not apply in her situation. So given that, is there an advantage to the 401k? No. In fact, I would say there's an advantage to the IRA. Why? Because you can choose where to open it. And with that choice, you can choose what to invest in. You will not be limited to the investments that your employer makes available to you through the 401k that it administers. Investments that are oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes very limited and very expensive. So if you don't have a contribution, an employer matching contribution, and if you're not going to exceed the IRA limits, frankly, I prefer an IRA. There is some, I guess, with a 401k, it's kind of easy because all the paperwork and stuff is there at your employer. You sign up online there, and they take the money right out of your paycheck. That being said, you can really set up the same thing with an IRA. Signing up for an IRA is no more difficult, whether you're going to sign up at a Vanguard or a Betterment or a broker or wherever. It's very easy to sign up, and you can have your contributions directed right out of your checking account, automated every month. So that was my response to Elizabeth. I actually think the IRA, all other things being equal, has more advantages than the 401k because of your investment choices. In fact, by the way, if your employer doesn't match and you can deduct your IRA contributions, what a lot of folks do is they'll even if they are going to max out, and even if they're going to need their 401k, they max out their IRA first, and then direct the rest of the money that they can contribute to retirement to their 401k. Again, because of the investment choices that you have available to you. Okay, the second email came from Blake. He writes in and he says, I worked for a college for about 10 months and they had mandatory contributions to a retirement account. I only have about $2,000 and because of the very limited funds, I'm looking to move this money. What would you recommend? My current 401k does not have very many options and I know most Vanguard funds have a $3,000 minimum, so I'm stuck on what to do. That's an interesting question because this retirement account at his former employer with $2,000 in it, he can't add to that. He no longer works there. So he either has to keep it there or move it somewhere. You can typically roll over your 401k to the 401k of your current employer if you want to. In Blake's case, as he mentioned, though, he doesn't care for their investment options, so he doesn't want to do that. And so what does he do? Well, he has a couple of options. One would be there are some Vanguard funds where the minimum is only $1,000. Those are typically their target date retirement funds. There may be others, so this is where you need to do a little bit of research. I do know that a lot of the Vanguard funds have a $3,000 minimum, as Blake pointed out, but some of them it's only $1,000, so that would be one option for Blake. Another option would be something like Betterment, where they don't have that minimum requirement. So that's a second option for him. A third option would be mutual funds that have much lower minimum contributions or minimum opening balance requirements. And this is where you just need to do some research. I guess I could try to go down. I mean, there's so many mutual funds, it would be impossible for me to list for you all of the ones that have minimums that are below $2,000. But what I would do is go to the main mutual fund companies. So you think Vanguard, of course, Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, Charles Schwab, and look at their mutual fund offerings and see what their minimums are. You could use a tool like Morningstar, and they have a fund. Morningstar has a mutual fund screener, and I'm looking at it now just because it came to me as I'm recording this podcast. I should have done this ahead of time. One thing I don't know is I think it's free. Yes, it is. They have a basic screener on mutual funds. Let me see if they have. Yes, they do. So if you go to, I'll give you the URL. It's kind of long, but here we go. It's screen.morningstar.com/fundselector.html. So that's one way to get to it. The other way is just to go to Morningstar. You'll see in their navigation at the top a link for tools. If you click on that, it'll take you to their tools. And the top section, you'll see some images. Below that, you'll see screening tools. And then you'll see something called Basic Screener. And there's a link for mutual fund. And one of the ways to screen the mutual funds is the minimum initial purchase less than or equal to, and then there's a drop-down box. And actually, one of the options is $2,000, so you could use that. And then if you wanted to just focus on index funds, because you're a smart investor, you could actually there's another drop-down that asks for expense ratios. And so you could say, let's see what they have. Expense ratio is less than or equal to, the smallest one they have is 50 basis points. That's 0.5%. That's pretty much going to exclude virtually all actively managed mutual funds. And then you could do the search and you'd get a lot of options there. So that's another way to find options. And so hopefully that helps out Blake. And if you're in a similar situation, hopefully that helps you. By the way, Blake's situation was, I think, unique in that the money was in a retirement account. If you're just starting to save and you're just collecting money in, say, a savings account until you have enough to meet a minimum, let's say you want to invest in the Vanguard S&P 500 fund with a $3,000 minimum, I would just recommend just keep saving until you hit that $3,000 minimum. It may seem like it takes forever, but I would do that over making an investment choice that for you, you thought was second best. But again, in Blake's case, he didn't have the means to add to the funds. So there you go. Hopefully that helped him and helps you if you're in a similar situation. Okay, now on to the main topic of today's show, and that it's a simple question. How much should you be saving for retirement? That's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to give you my thoughts on it. It's a problematic question in some regards. I mean, if you think about it, you could be some listening to this show might be 60 and getting ready to retire in the next few years. And the way they think about that question and the way they analyze their finances as they prepare for retirement will be, and should be, frankly, very different than someone that's 10 years or more away from retirement. And here's why. If you're near retirement, let's say you're 60, you've obviously, a lot of questions have been answered for you. You know how your career has progressed, I guess for better or worse, hopefully for better. You know your family situation. You know you likely know whether you'll have either your mortgage is paid off or will be paid off by the time you retire. You know your spending habits and patterns. You probably have some idea of how you want to live in retirement, where you want to live. So all of these questions, if they're not answered, you at least have a better or a clearer picture of how these things will play out for you. And as you move towards retirement, you can actually base your retirement analysis on an actual budget. This is what I'm spending. This is what I expect to spend. Hopefully, my mortgage will be paid off, so you won't have that expense, let's hope. Maybe you're going to move to a less expensive area of the country, perhaps. Whatever it is for you, you've got a pretty a good idea, hopefully, of a lot of this information. And you can calculate what you need to retire based on these actual numbers. You know, if you're 25, I mean, I look back when I was 25, I had, no idea how my career would go. I didn't know how many children we would have. I didn't know where we were living, of course, in Northern Virginia then, but would we stay there? I didn't know. There was a time when we almost moved to Delaware. I guess maybe not a big change, but it would have been a change. So, there's a lot of unknowns when you're 25. And frankly, that's true when you're 35, 45. I think generally when you've got 10 years or more from retirement, there are oftentimes a lot of unknowns. And so when you think about the question, how much should you be saving for retirement when you're 10 years or more away from retiring, you have to kind of make some assumptions. And you tend not to make decisions with the same level of precision that you might when you're nearing retirement. And so given that problem, I thought this would be a good topic for today's show, and I want to kind of give you some thoughts on how you might think about, for those that are still many years away from retiring, how much you should be saving for retirement and kind of whether you're on track or not. So here's what we're going to do. First of all, I'm going to quickly tell you my approach, which I'm pretty confident you will find unsatisfactory. And so I'll move through that quickly. Because my approach, I think, is somewhat unconventional. Then I'll get to the more conventional approach, which is the rule of thumb. I'll talk about the rule of thumb. Then I'll ask the most important question you can ask in investing in personal finance, and that is why. Why that rule of thumb? We'll talk about it. We'll actually do some math. We'll look at the assumptions underlying the rule of thumb, and then we'll talk about what happens when those assumptions don't line up with your life. That's so often the case. All these rules of thumb, they're fine, but underpinning any rule of thumb, whether it's how much you should spend on a house, on a car, how much should you be saving for retirement, there are all these assumptions, and you really need to understand those assumptions, because what you might find out is that many of them don't apply to you. And once you realize that, you can make some adjustments to a rule of thumb, and I think in most cases come to a decision for you and your family that's more applicable, more specific to your situation. Okay, that's the plan for today. Let's see if we can make this happen. My approach. So I don't really think about saving X percent for retirement. My approach is frankly to save as much as I can. And it's not for retirement per se. It's not so that I can work until whatever, I'm 65, and then stop working and then spend all this money that I've saved. In fact, my hope is that our nest egg continues to grow even through retirement. And my goal is that, when I go to that great big mutual fund in the sky, I'll have some money for my family. Of course, I'll leave them, and then I can give a lot to charity. That's my goal. And so I don't save your typical, X percent. My goal is to save as much as I possibly can. I try to bring balance to our lives. We want to enjoy life, like I think everybody does, but I do try to save as much as we can. So for many years now, we've been saving upwards of 50% or more of our gross income. This year, I think it will be lower in part because our income will be a little bit lower. This year, I'm thinking, of course, the year's not over, so we'll see. But I'm thinking we'll save about a third of our gross income. And so that's been my approach. Again, it's not so that I can just stop working at 65. In fact, I kind of hope I don't start working. I know there are a lot of folks in the early retirement crowd. If by that folks mean stop working and do nothing, that's just not how I'm built. So that's not really my plan. I think, to me, Warren Buffett's got it right. He found something that he loves to do, and he's going to do it as long as he can. To me, that's the kind of the model I have in mind. So I told you my approach would probably be unsatisfactory or at least unhelpful to a lot of people. So with that, let's move through and go to the rule of thumb. So what's the rule of thumb? If you get online and you Google how much should I be saving for retirement, and you look at personal finance blogs, websites, studies from mutual fund companies or finance professors, experts, CFPs, whatever, you're going to generally find a rule of thumb of this: save 10 to 15% of your gross pay. That's the rule of thumb. Now, I know there's kind of a big difference between 10% and 15%. You'll see I've seen 12%, but everything I've looked at, the range is between 10 and 15% of your gross pay. Now, the big question, the important question is why? Why that number or that range? How did they come up with that? Well, I did a little bit of math that I'm going to share with you, and I made some assumptions, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, but let me just run through the math. What I assumed was a family was making $100,000 a year. I picked that number just because it's easy. It's a round number. And they saved 10%. I used the bottom end of this range. They saved 10% a year. That's $10,000. They saved it for 40 years, started when they were 25 until they were 65. And I assumed no inflation. So I assumed that the pay never went up. I assumed the amount that they could save never went up. And I took inflation out of their returns. So rather than assuming that their investments would earn 7 or 8%, let's say, I assumed they'd earn 5%. That was my assumption, sort of the real return, the after inflation return. And so then I just calculated what would they have if they started saving $10,000 a year for 40 years, earning a real return, after inflation return of 5%. Well, using our good friend, the Excel spreadsheet, the formula is pretty simple. Equal sign FV for future value, open paren, 5%, comma, 40 for 40 years, comma, negative 10,000. It's negative because you consider it like a payment into a retirement fund. It produces a positive result. And it comes out to, are you ready? $1.2 million. Actually, $1,207,997.74 for those of you keeping score at home. Now, what does that generate? Well, if you assume, again, another assumption, I'm going to list these assumptions so we keep track of them. But if we assume you can spend 4% of your nest egg in year one, that would generate about $48,000 in retirement income in year one. Again, we've taken out inflation. I then went to the Social Security Administration. They have a benefits calculator. It's called the Social Security Quick Calculator. You can Google it. Actually, if you want it, the URL is ssa.gov/OACT/QuickCalc. Or you can just Google Social Security Quick Calculator. It actually estimates what your benefits will be in either today's dollars or inflated dollars. If you're going to retire many years from now, they can tell you what it will likely look like in inflated dollars down the road. So for a family making $100,000 a year, about to retire now, the estimate was $33,000 a year in Social Security benefits. You add that to the $48,000, and you end up with a first-year retirement income of $81,319.91. Now, you look at that number and you say, well, wait a minute, Rob, they were making $100,000 before they retired. Now you're saying they're only going to make $81,000 in retirement income based on all of these assumptions and whatnot. Yes, that's right. And that's kind of the general theory behind the financial industry's view of how much you need to save for retirement. The general view is you don't need 100% of your pre-retirement income. For starters, you're going to be saving for retirement out of that pre-retirement income, something you won't be doing when you retire, of course. Secondly, when you're working, you're paying payroll taxes, FICA and Medicare, and you won't be paying those either. And so the general rule of thumb is you need 80 to 85% of your pre-retirement income in retirement to maintain your standard of living. So in this scenario we've walked through, $81,000 came out to 81% of the pre-retirement income. And that's it. That sort of walks through. I know there's a lot of numbers. I'm throwing them at you. I'm going to kind of come back and regroup all this, hopefully, here in a minute. But that kind of walks you through this sort of rule of thumb and how they come up with it. Now, if you think about it, there are a lot of assumptions underlying this rule of thumb. We're going to walk through them. But real quickly, before we do, I took the bottom range of that rule of thumb, 10%. Some say as high as 15%. Well, what happens if this hypothetical family saved 15% instead of 10? Remember, if they saved 10%, 40 years, real return of 5%, they end up with $1.2 million. Well, if they were to save 15%, $15,000 a year, it jumps to $1.8 million. That, in turn, assuming 4% withdrawal rate, produces $72,000 in income in year one. You add that to the $33,000 of Social Security, and you end up with a total first year in retirement income of $105,000, obviously more than their pre-retirement income. Now, again, a lot of assumptions there, but I just give you that number because, one, it's a big difference between 10% and 15%. You may be saying, well, wait a minute. If 15% gives you so much more, it results in more income in retirement than pre-retirement. Why would that ever be a rule of thumb? Well, part of that answer is because some people use different underlying assumptions. And so let's talk about those. What are the big assumptions in this math that I've walked through that are important to you and to me? The first one, and I think probably the most significant one, is that in this hypothetical, the family saved for 40 years. They saved starting when they were 25, and they saved, in the lower range example, 10% of their income each and every year for 40 years. Most people don't do that. You may be listening to this and saying, Rob, that's not helpful to me. I'm 47 and I'm just starting to save. Now what do I do? Well, hopefully the answer is not retire at 87. We'll come back to the what do I do in a minute. Let's stick with the assumptions. That's the biggest one. Now, maybe you have been saving. Maybe you started when you were 25 and you will save for 40 years and you will save 10% or more. Great. But we all know that a lot of people don't do that. That's the first huge assumption underlying all of this fancy math. They saved for 40 years. Second big assumption is that they earn 5% after inflation. That's an assumption. We don't know what the stock market's going to return. We don't know what the bond market is going to return. So that's a big assumption. Now, it could be more. It could end up being more, real return higher than 5%. That would be great. And by the way, just to show you a little bit of math, the saving $10,000 a year, it resulted in $1.2 million. Let's just bump the 5% to 7%. Wow, $1.2 million goes to just under $2 million. But that's a big assumption. 7% after inflation is a huge assumption and not one that I would make for planning purposes. But I mentioned that. We've talked about this in the past. Small changes, well, actually, 2% increase in total returns over 40 years is not a small change, as you can see. But these small changes have a huge, huge impact. So that's the second big assumption. You earn 5% after inflation. Okay, the third assumption is that we can safely withdraw 4% of our nest egg in year one of retirement. So just as a sort of a refresher, the way the 4% rule works is you can withdraw 4% of your nest egg your first year of retirement and then increase that amount, whatever it is, by the rate of inflation for each year following in retirement. Now, the 4% rule has been around for a long time. It depends on actually earning 7 or 8% in your investments, and the idea is you withdraw 4%, you keep the rest of it in your investments to account for inflation from year to year. Some folks say, that's too aggressive now. The stock market's not going to return enough to support a 4% withdrawal rate. Others say, no, it's still reasonable, and maybe you can even withdraw more. These are very important questions when you're actually retiring and in retirement and making these decisions. For planning purposes, I kind of like the 4% rule. I think it's fairly reasonable, but the point is it's an assumption. You may want to take a more conservative approach and assume 3.5% or 3%. So that's the third assumption. By the way, we discussed the 4% rule in some detail with folks from Vanguard in podcast 46. So that's DoughRoller.net/podcast46. You can check that out if you want to understand more about that sort of rule of thumb for withdrawals in retirement. Okay, the fourth assumption is that you need about 80 to 85% of your pre-retirement income in retirement. And that's a big assumption and a very important one, and one to give some thought to. But again, when you're 25 trying to figure all this out, I think it's a reasonable assumption. As you get closer and closer to retirement, you may make adjustments to it. For example, you may know for certain that you'll have your home paid off and that you won't be making a significant mortgage payment each month. And so maybe, you could make an assumption that's a lot lower than 80%. Again, this is where you need to one, understand the assumptions that are going into the rule of thumb so that you can then tailor them to your specific circumstances. The fifth and final assumption that we'll talk about, these are the ones that I think are the most important underlying this 10 to 15% of gross pay rule of thumb, is that Social Security will still exist when it comes time for you to retire. That's a big question in folks' minds, and I actually plan to put together a podcast on my views of where Social Security stands today, what issues is it facing, and will it still be around? Here's my personal view, is one, I think Social Security in some form will still exist when certainly folks listening to this podcast retire. That's my belief. Now, I can be wrong. That's my belief. I also believe that it will change significantly. For example, I think the age of retirement will continue to go up. And I also think they could means test it. They could change how they tax it. So I think benefits for many people will erode, is my view. But I still think it will be around. Now, that being said, for me personally, I don't factor in Social Security for planning purposes. But again, as I mentioned earlier, my approach to saving generally is probably a lot different than most folks. But all that being said, I still think it'll be around even 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. But I do think it will change over those decades. And the benefits could be less than they are today for many people. Okay, but the point is, those are sort of the big assumptions that I think you need to be aware of when you're thinking about how much to save for retirement. Again, the assumptions: you'll save for 40 years, you'll have a 5% after inflation return, you'll follow the 4% rule of withdrawals in retirement, you need 80 to 85% of your pre-retirement income during retirement, and that Social Security in some form will exist when you retire. Now, what's the point of understanding those assumptions? I know you're asking, well, so what, Rob? Great, you did the math, you figured out all these underlying assumptions. Who cares? How does it help me? Well, it will help you because you need to look at those assumptions and ask, do they make sense for you? So, for example, if you're 45 and just starting to save for retirement, an assumption that you're going to save for 40 years is probably not a very realistic assumption for you. So what I want to do is just sort of quickly go down these assumptions, at least a couple of them, and talk about how you might be able to sort of drill down on those issues and figure out what makes the most sense for you. So let's start with what I think is the most important one, and that is the save for 40 years. I understand that a lot of people haven't done that or won't do it for whatever reason. So just a few thoughts and things that you might consider and that might be able to help you. The first is, and I've written about this on DoughRoller, and I'm going to pull up the link. What I'll do is I'll include a link to this article in the show notes. But it has to do with a book called Money Ratios. It's written by Charles Farrell. I think it's a very good high-level book on money ratios as they relate to retirement. And I actually did a podcast on them on this issue as well. So let me just quickly. I'm pulling these up so that I can give you the URLs. The first the first one is the podcast. It's podcast 31. So if you go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 31, you'll hear my take on this concept of money ratios. Just in a nutshell, what it does is Charles Farrell assumes that when you retire, you need 12 times your pre-retirement income saved. Now, if you remember back earlier in this episode, when I did some math, assuming you save 10%, and that's actually what it came out to, right? The assumption was $100,000 a year, and if you save 10%, you earn 5% in after inflation returns. After 40 years, you ended up with $1.2 million, 12x your pre-retirement income. So he assumes that, but then what he does is, and this is where I think his work is so helpful, it says, okay, here's what you need to be saving to hit that mark, and here's how much you need to have at age 25, 35, 45, 55 to be on track. And the reason I like it is, if you're 45 and you've got X dollars saved, and you're like, well, I haven't been saving enough, I know that, but golly, where do I stand? It's complicated. I've got whatever. I've got $200,000 in the bank, but I know I'm not where I should be. How do I figure that out? I think his book, Money Ratios, it can be very helpful. So I would start with the podcast. Again, that's DoughRoller.net/podcast 31. I also have written an article about money ratios, and I will link to it in the show notes. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would suggest is, for those starting later in life to save for retirement, you can learn a ton from the early retirement crowd. Those people that retired at 30. That may not be you. It's certainly not me. And it's frankly, I'll be honest with you, it's not a choice I would make. The retire at 30 and live on $25,000 a year is just, it's just not a choice that I would make. But a lot of people have done it and are very happy and content, and you can learn a lot from them. So here's the thing. You may not be retiring early, but you can learn a lot from their ability to retire in, say, 10 years of a working period. They worked for 10 years and then they retired. Well, how'd they do it? That can be a big help to you if you're, say, 55, 50, whatever, and you're behind in saving. So for that, I would recommend two things. The first is DoughRoller.net/podcast 7. That's where I interviewed Mr. Money Mustache, who retired at 30 after working for all of 9 years. He tells you how he did it. So that can be very helpful to those starting later in life. The other thing that I would recommend is, frankly, that you sign up for my newsletter. And here's an example as to why. I wrote an article this week for U.S. News it was about 5 steps baby boomers can take who started late saving for retirement. So here's the thing. I include links in my weekly newsletter, not only to articles on DoughRoller, but also to articles I've written elsewhere, usually Huffington Post, U.S. News, and Forbes. So it's just an easy way to get them every week, and you can see what's helpful to you and read it or whatever. I'll include a link to that article in the newsletter that goes out this Saturday. Now, you may be listening to this podcast long after that. So, but for those listening currently, you'll find a link to that article, and you can subscribe to the newsletter. Just go to DoughRoller.net/newsletter. The other, sort of the final thing I would say, and by the way, you notice I'm not giving you easy answers. If you haven't started saving for retirement and you're 55, there are no easy answers. And I think it's important to understand that. I'm not going to try to suggest that, no worries, just follow these 3 steps and everything will be fine. No, you got to make some choices right now. You need to make some sacrifices. And you're going to have to make some hard decisions. And we ought not candy coat that and take it lightly, because it's a serious, it's some serious choices that have come up. But one thing I would challenge folks on, this is something I try to challenge myself on, and my children, when they they'll say, I can't save, I don't have enough money to save, and then they pull out their iPhone and they have their cable package at home, and it's like, well, wait a minute, let's step back for a second. If you're in a situation where you're not saving and you have cable, okay? And I'm just picking cable. I don't mean to pick on cable TV, whatever, but I'm just picking it. What you should be saying is, I choose to have cable rather than to save for retirement. That's the choice you're making. And I say that not to pick on you or pick on myself, but actually I find that kind of thinking empowering. The viewpoint of, I can't save, I just don't have enough money, I don't like that. It plays the victim. I don't want to be the victim. I understand some people are in extremely difficult situations. They've lost a job, they have medical expenses, so I understand there are extreme circumstances. But for most of us, and most of the people that I talk to who will make statements like that, I can't save for retirement right now, I just don't have the money. That kind of sort of victim mentality, I think, is wrong, and it's not accurate. They could save for retirement if they wanted to. They're choosing not to. And by the way, I'm not judging that choice. That may be a perfectly fine choice for you. That's a choice you have to make. But I think if you say, I choose to drive a $30,000 car that I've borrowed for 5 years to own, rather than save for retirement, it puts the responsibility on you, which some people don't like. But I think it's important to do that, and I think it's empowering. Okay, hope that didn't sound too preachy. So, saving for 40 years, a big assumption. If you're behind the curve, you need to get on top of that now. I think some of those resources that I've mentioned and that you'll see in the show notes will be of help to you. Okay, next assumption I want to talk about briefly, the 5% real return. Here's the deal on that. I have no idea what the stock market's going to return. Nobody does. But I do know what's important. One is having an asset allocation plan and sticking to it. I think generally you got to be heavily weighted in equities and stocks versus bonds. Now, exactly what that means for you is something you're going to have to decide. To me, for most people, it's somewhere between 60% stocks and 40% bonds, up to 80% stocks and 20% bonds. I know there are some of you crazies out there that have 100% in equities. Go for it. I just hope you stick to that plan. I don't think that's right for most people. By the way, I kind of have fun of those folks that email me and say they're in 100% equities. That was me for a while. So, and I think it was the right choice for me, but I was much younger then. Okay, so you got to have an asset allocation plan. It's got to be weighted towards equities, towards stocks, and you got to stick to it, and you got to keep your fees to an absolute minimum. Those are all things that you can control. And what you can control, you must control. The things you can't control, the stock market, you just got to let it go because you can't control it. So there you go on the 5% real return assumption. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Hopefully it's a little better than that. Could be a little worse. But again, we need to understand those things that we can control, asset allocation, costs, sticking to our plan, and we need to control those things that we can control. I've already talked about the 4% withdrawal rate, so I won't go over that more. Again, it is an assumption. I'll only say this. If you want to be more conservative with your planning, you just lower that assumption to 3.5%, for example. On the spending 80% of your pre-retirement income, one of the things that I like about saving, I guess I call them super savers. The thing I like about saving 20% or 30% or 40% or 50% is it lowers the amount of your pre-retirement income you actually need to live on. And when you can learn to live on less, it really takes a lot of pressure off of the retirement savings. It takes a lot of the pressure off all of those other assumptions we made. When you're saving 20 or 30%, I may not need to save for 40 years. It's okay that I only save for 30 or whatever. I don't have to worry about a 5% real return. I mean, I hope I get that or better, but if I get 4%, I'll be fine, right? And you may not even need to worry about a 4% withdrawal rate, depending on how much you have, what you need. I mean, you may only need 2% withdrawal rate, depending on what you've spent. So the more you can save and still be content and have a balanced life, it takes the pressure off of all of those other assumptions. The fifth assumption I've already talked about, Social Security. Like I said, I'm going to put together a podcast in more detail on my thoughts about where Social Security stands and whether it will, exist 40 years from now or not. So there you go. Again, basic rule of thumb: you need to be saving 10 to 15% of gross pay. We've walked through the big assumptions underlining that rule of thumb. I've hopefully given you some thoughts on what to do when those assumptions don't work for you, and they oftentimes don't. And by the way, this is sort of my approach to all financial rules of thumb. I don't follow any of them blindly, and I don't follow any personal financial advice blindly. I try to understand the motivations of the person giving me that advice. I try to understand the assumptions underlining that advice or rule of thumb, and then I ask whether those assumptions apply to me. That's sort of the approach that I've taken. I think it leads to decisions that are tailored to you, to your circumstances, and to what you and your family need and what you value. So there you go in a nutshell. Hey, if you want to let me know how much you're saving for retirement, shoot me an email, or if you have questions or comments, love to hear from you. As I've mentioned many, many times, I read every email and I respond to every email. And again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Love for folks to come on the show and be interviewed. Again, success stories, questions, whatever, just shoot me an email. And, if you're just a pet lover and you want to send me in a picture, happy to hear from you. Happy to include the picture in the show notes. And remember, go to the show notes here, DoughRoller.net/podcast82 to see a picture of Harley. Cute as can be. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.